So welcome to Building Cross-Cultural Competency. This is the second session in a series of two. The last session was really about going in depth on the terminology. While we're going to go over the terminology again really quickly, this will be more about kind of the practical steps. We'll have some interactive moments, lots of question periods, or spaces for asking questions, talking things through, and just kind of exploring the steps of building this competency and the skill set. Always want to start off by saying that we are a government-funded program, so we are funded by Global Affairs. This is our last year of funding. So this is I feel like I keep saying this is the exciting part of kind of seeing the ways that we wrap moments up and prepare for the future. And we are housed at Cooperation Canada. So today's agenda. So we'll go over some of the regular ground setting and welcoming bits, and then we'll have some moments around, like I said, the terminology, some of the key concepts. Then we'll go into some practical application. We'll go into some breakout rooms for some case studies, some discussion, some reflection. And then just going through some of the ways in which we can build our toolkits, our toolboxes on how to build this skill, and then kind of grounding us in the fact that this is an ongoing journey before we close out today's session. I want to start by acknowledging that I am in what is colonially known as Montreal, and traditionally known as Shipshake, the traditional land of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. As someone who is deeply rooted in community organizing, in community knowledge systems and traditional knowledge systems, the way in which I relate to Indigenous communities, especially as an educator, as someone who works in the space of kind of sharing knowledge that I've collected over years of engaging with others. I find it, especially in trainings, an important thing to remind us that I think a lot of the time when we're in spaces like this, we're really looking for the kind of one size fits all of the steps to kind of move us through these discussions and building these skill sets. But I think for me, in the way that I like to share knowledge and the way in which I've been in relationship to Indigenous communities, both here and in Ottawa, where I lived before, and the Indigenous communities to which I belong from my family side, has always been in kind of bringing us back to the childlike way that we used to learn, and attached to concepts in which, in a way that we build kind of our worldview and really wanting to have a good way of engaging with others, of knowing ourselves. And so I don't love to take the educational process overtly seriously. I think that this is a very vulnerable space that we exist in while we're learning, and building skills and questioning ourselves and kind of reflecting on the future, the past, the present, and all of the difficulty and the complex ideas that come with being in those processes. And so I think that in both honoring my relationships to the land, to Indigenous communities, to the way that we project ourselves into the future in a good way, and we build the skills to be able to do that. I think this is always a time that I like to remind us that honoring is a commitment in all things that we do. And that goes from the way that we wake up, the decisions that we make, and the stuff that we buy, how we choose to learn and share knowledge, how we engage with each other, and a lot of the concepts that we'll learn today. So this slideshow will exist on our website after this presentation. And on this slide, there are some reflection questions that I like to share with folks to kind of reflect back on with and for themselves and their organizations. Just to remind us that land honorings are, again, less about the words and more about the actions. So the importance of the thing that brings us all together today, cultural competency, what it is, what it looks like, how we get there, what is its importance. For a lot of people, cultural competency is really just how we understand the effective, safe, good ways in which we engage with people across diverse cultures. It's always important to understand that cultural competency is kind of a concept that goes through a continuum. It's kind of like steps that you get to cultural sensitivity and awareness, and competency as a skill. So a lot of the time it does start with, sorry, I heard a voice. I'm not sure if somebody wanted to say something. Oh, okay, no worries. Just so you know, you can interrupt me at any point if you have any questions, comments, concerns. So with cultural competency, we always like to start off with awareness, with a lot of the terminology that we deal with in equity-based practices, in community-based practices, and culture and society-based principles and understandings. It's always important to start with awareness. So when we talk about awareness, we really want to first be looking inward. So recognizing our own understanding and relationship to culture, what are our beliefs, our biases, our values, our perspectives, our traditions, what makes up our culture, what makes up our identity, what makes us a person that exists in the culture, in a culture and that has been built, and in a person, an identity that has been built by and informed by a culture. And then kind of with that awareness, we seek out knowledge. So the idea of really trying to learn more about cultural practices. So kind of extending ourselves more into the side of the diversity that exists in cultures outside of ourselves. So what other cultural practices, beliefs, and values exist. And then while we're in that process, because we understand that coming from a culture and being informed and shaped by the aspects of that culture, while we're learning other cultures, those will be, that process will be defined by our home or our start culture or the culture that we identify with. It's always important to kind of, as we're in that process, be developing the tools to interact with other cultures. So the knowledge process, I always like to say, is somewhat still personal. It's not necessarily the space where a lot of people will go right into engaging with other cultures. It can be about research. It can be kind of in ways where you're kind of still at a distance. Of course, everybody, depending on their skill set in the space of knowledge, will engage differently. But the idea is that you go from the knowledge to the skill, or skill mixes with the knowledge, and you develop those tools to interact in a safe way, in a good way, in an appropriate way, in a considerate way, in a respectful way with different cultural contexts. And the skill part is, I do find one of the most important ones alongside the attitudes. So while we're building those skills, while we're collecting that knowledge, while we're aiming to be aware, what are the ways in which we are continuing to be open-minded, reflecting, challenging ourselves, kind of testing out our process to make sure that we're remaining accountable to the fact that we are in a process of wanting to be more culturally competent, aware, sensitive, and that does come with needing to have an understanding of how our attitudes towards those things and the way in which we project ourselves in the future of that process can have an effect on a lot of people, a lot of things, a lot of different spaces. And so, yeah, in the attitudes section, or in the attitudes process, or the part of our journey, really kind of wanting to focus on the open-mindedness of our open-mindedness, the way in which we're valuing diversity. And I think valuing is really important, and we'll talk about it later, what valuing looks like, what it means, and intentionally demonstrating respect and cultural differences. And I'll use the word intentionally often, because I think when we say demonstrating respect and when we say intentionally demonstrating respect, I think those are two different processes and ways of getting to that idea. And so you'll hear me say it a lot in our sector, and just generally. Cultural competency is the least important as a concept and most important as a practice in a sector where we work with a lot of global cultures globally. It's important in things like building trust, enhancing our effectiveness, making sure that we're having a good impact, making sure even within our organizations, as organizations that are made up of multiple of people from different cultures, and that in themselves as organizations involve or bring up different cultures. I think it's always important to bring back the fact that cultural competency is, and a lot of the things we'll talk about today are concepts that really are brought to the forefront, are really made important by their application. Yeah. So culture, I think just in terms of wanting to give a quick refresher for folks who maybe, I think a lot of the time we throw words around and don't really delve into them. Um, and so when we're talking about culture, we're talking about values, beliefs, norms, customs, and there can be a longer list of components, but these are the ones that we tend to refer to most often when we're thinking about culture and how we evaluate how people engage in cultures, understand different cultures, and understand themselves within their culture. So values, often the principles and or standards that exist at the core of what makes up a culture. So for a lot of cultures, a lot of the cultures that the culture I come from, respect for elders is really important. In our culture, in the Western culture, we know that we talk a lot about individualism versus collectivism. The idea of power distance, cooperative versus competitive. So these are all different types of values that can be at the center of what a culture can find important or prioritizes. After that, we have beliefs. So beliefs, of course, exist even outside of culture. So they're deep convictions and accepted truths that are upheld by individuals or groups. So they can be religious, they can be health-based, educational, family composition, based. They can be how we think about success or what we define success to be. And that can be really important in what makes a culture and how someone engages with a culture. Norms are behaviors and social rules that shape the way that people engage. So gender roles, social etiquette, communication styles, relationships to time, rituals, and traditions are all different things that can inform or make up norms in a culture. And then the customs, so the traditional practices and rituals that are regularly observed, festivals, ceremonies, ways of greeting, everyday practices, dining customs. I come from, part of my background comes from a country that is mostly Muslim. And so the fact that we have Eid and we have Ramadan becomes a really big way in which the culture informs how spaces are made up and how the day-to-day shifts and how people are meant to engage with folks during a specific time. And so I just think that these can all obviously be expanded on. There are so many more components of culture, but these are some of the ones that we like to found ourselves on when we're building our initial understanding of culture, when we're evaluating ourselves, and also when we're trying to understand others. So cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, cultural humility are kind of the process through which we see ourselves moving uh, through achieving cultural competency. So there's a lot of in cultural competency, I think all of it, and like I mentioned at the beginning, all of it is a process. It is always, I mean, it feels like a bunch of different processes happening at once, all kind of different, all kind of the same. Um, and so we start off a lot of time with cultural awareness, which can move us from recognition to understanding to application. And so this is a bit, again, back to when we're talking about the awareness at the beginning. It can look like knowing a colleague's religious beliefs and practices and accommodating them. So making sure that we are using our awareness to adapt our ways of being. Cultural sensitivity, so the movement from empathy to respect to adaptation, is again about adjusting workplace expectation, can be about adjusting workplace expectation based on cultural norms. And so I think a lot of the time when we talk about different types of sensitivities built in equity processes, one of the things that becomes really important is how are we challenging structures that make certain groups or certain identities um, marginalize certain groups or identities. How do we challenge those systems? How do we challenge those structures to show that sensitivity in a way where we're shifting and making more space for those communities, identities to be able to exist and flourish. And then we have cultural humility. So the understanding that this is an ongoing process, engaging continuously and consistently in self-reflection, and making sure that we're educating ourselves and often being able to pass that information down. So self-reflection to learning to challenging power dynamics. I think a lot of the time people are like, I feel the need to be right at the challenging systems and structures and policies and the government. And I think we do have to understand that it is a process. There are some of us who are doing those things, and there are some of us that are in the place of reflecting and understanding what that journey is going to look for them in terms of their responsibilities in challenging the systems that make marginalize different cultures. So that can look like seeking feedback from local communities and adapting practices. An ongoing theme will be adaptation and adjustment and accommodation. So I think intersectionality is a term that a lot of us have heard, but I never want to assume that we're all on the same level. We're all coming from different perspectives. So often want to, or coming from different spaces in our journey. So really quickly, intersectionality was created by a Black woman called Kimberly Crenshaw. It was a term that was specifically meant to kind of talk about the relationship between race and gender as a Black woman. And over the years has been stretched to kind of help us understand how, as individuals, we're made up of multiple identities, and those identities intersect in a way that informs our unique experience and relationship to power and privilege, and can have really big effects on how we are oppressed or not in our society. And so it kind of puts everybody in different expectation groups and responsibilities, and informs a lot of the way in which we are meant to move through society as responsible, aware, sensitive people seeking to implement and be committed to justice. So diversity, another concept that comes up often when we're talking about cultural competency, when we're talking about different equity-based practices. So diversity is I think something that in the work of being someone that works in EDI, we talk a lot about diversity. And I think that we've gotten to a place in as a society where we understand that diversity is kind of like the foundation. It is the thing that other things grow from. We have to have diverse societies. We have to have diverse organizations. We have to have diverse boards. We have to have diversity in the people who are building programs and evaluating programs, and all of the spaces and the ways in which decision making and structure building and challenging is happening. It's important for us to make sure that we're having diverse voices, and especially the voices of the most marginalized. So diversity looks like recruiting a diverse board of directors, but inclusion then, which tends to be the next step, the thing that we work towards it after diversity, is meant to ensure that diverse voices are represented in decision making. So not only that there's a diverse board, but to make sure that when we're making decisions, when we're voting on things, when we're building our strategic vision, all of the ways in which we kind of organize ourselves and build the structures that we exist in, that it's not just that we have people who represent diversity, but they're being included in ways that are really concrete and bring up concepts of equity, which is the next kind of step towards building sustainability. So equity, I think, I feel like is a term that we hear a lot about, but often kind of let go in the space of equality, or making space for just equality. And I think equity, it's always important for us to understand that it is the thing of sustainability. Without equity, all of the things that we work on tend to fall apart because the idea of equity is to resource everyone to a space, to a point, um, where we all have the opportunity to achieve similar outcomes. So we've all seen the diagram of the fence and then the people trying to look at the fence, and they all are different heights. And if you give them all the same box, not everyone can see, but if you give them all boxes that are relevant to their different heights, then everyone can see. So making sure that everyone is resourced with what they need, not just kind of dishing out the same thing to everyone. And I think that that tends to be a really important concept in cultural competency, in the idea that there can't be a one size fits all when we're thinking about cultures, which are living beings, which are constantly evolving, which are constantly changing. How do we ensure that we are meeting people within those cultures? How do we make sure that we are creating monitoring systems? How do we create ways of engaging? How do we build relationships in a way that really address and engage the diversity that we are being confronted with? So I just spoke at you for a while. I just wanted to see if anyone has any questions, comments, concerns before we go into our first interactive bit. We'll be going into 3 breakout rooms. So in the 3 breakout rooms, there'll be 3 different activities. So the first one will just be, and these are really, again, one of the things that's really important for us is understanding that everybody is at different levels. And so we want to really emphasize that these spaces are meant to be safe, free of judgment. We're all here to learn. We're all here to share. We're all here to exist in a way to be able to kind of grow and challenge ourselves in a way that is comfortable and supported. And so these activities are not meant to be stressful or really difficult. We have thought about them to be kind of simple and welcoming. So the first one is an interactive self-assessment quiz. So there are a few short questions that folks will be able to move through, and then kind of have some time to reflect. And then the second one is are just some self-reflective questions. So you can do them as a group or individually, and then a breakout room to kind of discuss personal experiences. So explore what your experiences have been, what they've looked like, kind of brainstorm strategies that you've used or not, or are looking to be able to use. And so, yeah, feel free to move through the 3 breakout rooms. The idea is for this to be flexible. Yeah, so we will open the breakout rooms and then folks can kind of self-organize. Okay, welcome back. Um, I just wanted to take a moment to kind of hear if there was anything that anyone wanted to share in terms of their reflections, anything that came up in the conversations that you were having, or just in your personal reflections if you were doing it kind of more solo. No pressure.
Well, I don't, I only had time to do the first breakout room, the self-assessment quiz,
Awesome.
because I was I was trying to figure out how this worked. And then I went into the second breakout, and I think it was in silence. Then we all started to talk, trying to help each other. So I never got to the third group discussion. But the first exercise, the interactive self-assessment quiz, was pretty neat. I loved that we had to score ourselves, and I scored 29 points, developing cultural awareness. So I knew it's humbling, but it's okay, because I had a international delegation back in March where we had difficult cultural interactions, and that like humbled me. Like, okay, Laura, no, you're not that cultural savvy. So it kind of hurts the ego that you're not up there in the advanced cultural awareness, but that's okay. I'm accepting that. I'm still learning. I'm still developing cultural awareness. So I really appreciated that self-assessment and the points. And yeah, so good self-assessment. I wish we could have more time to go to the actual breakout room and group discussion, but I guess we're doing it right now. I think this is what's happening right now, which is better.
And I think that one of the things that I always like to add in when we do these types of self-assessment quizzes is that they are, I think, a lot of the time meant to be humbling, because there is the trick of the quiz is that there's no one that ever really gets to the kind of like the highest level, because cultures are always evolving, because the ways in which engagement is built and the expectation and the priorities and kind of the ways that we're all learning each other always evolves. So do our practices. And there's always, I feel like the line is always moving. So I appreciate, thank you for your honesty. Thank you for also doing the exercise. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to add, I think there's something really important in the humility and just being able to know that there is something magical in the being able to continue to grow and being committed to that. So thank you for sharing. Maria?
Hello. Yes, I also did the cultural awareness self-assessment quiz and found it really a very good tool for my own personal reflection on cultural competency, as well as something that we can potentially use within our organization as we also work towards our own anti-racism work. I also didn't fare very well. I scored 26 points, but that's also like a good indication that there is much to learn and much more to also to change in terms of my actions as well as my attitudes, and also to increase awareness on cultural competency. So one thing that I noted is that, for example, for the questions number 6 and number 8, which relates to designing and implementing projects. So I encounter this every day in my line of work, but I find that it's really also hard to be culturally competent when doing or when designing projects and implementing projects, because there are systemic barriers within this sector, like the colonialism, and it's really hard to elevate the voice of our partners overseas, because we are sort of here in Canada, we are supposed to be the one, we are the purse holders. So there is that dynamic between the purse holders and those who receive the assistance. So that's those are the systemic barriers that makes it hard for us to really be culturally competent when designing and implementing projects.
Well, thank you for sharing and bringing that up. I think it's always important for us to be cognizant of the fact that I think it will always be a little bit difficult to be learning about these principles inside a system and a structure that is kind of built to oppose the development of those principles. And so I think it's always something that we have to remind ourselves that it's not always going to be just us that have to grow and learn. Sometimes we've done all that we can, and it's now up to what do we do, how do we challenge the system, but also how does the system challenge itself to change and move forward. And hopefully with us building more skills can do more advocacy work and kind of moving the needle. So thank you for sharing and bringing that up. Was there anyone else who wanted to share? So for this next space, we'll be going over some case studies. So there'll be 3 breakout rooms again. And each group will be able to, like, we'll do 1 case study, or however many you cycle through. They are really simple, meant to be kind of built and elaborated as you folks see fit and how your conversations will go. And so again, we'll open up the breakout rooms, and then folks can kind of self-select. And if you have any questions or needs, please do feel free to let us know. For communities, being able to listen and prioritize their experience, their needs, their histories. The main principles that I operate from is that a community is the expert to the problems they face and the solutions that they need, and the only expert. And so what does it look like to be working towards a model where we aren't always trying to make the compromise between our goals and what we want to accomplish in our project objectives and what the community needs, and what does it mean to look at what the community needs, what their experiences have been, how history has informed their relationship to us, and make sure that all of our practices are in line with making sure that they're supported in the way that they need, versus us needing to prioritize in any way our own ideas of what is good or right or necessary. I know that that was maybe a not an answer to your question, but in some way kind of saying I don't really tend to offer the right way because I don't know the right way. It's always going to be up to the people who are in the situation themselves. And the idea is that we're testing things out, and we're always open to the feedback from the people that we're working with to adapt, and making sure that we're accountable to being in a process of reciprocity with the folks that we're working with.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you. Like that was beautifully said, and I totally agree. Definitely it's just about adapting and putting the needs of the community first, and being able and willing to change your either organizational goals or objectives, programs according to the communities you're working in. So thank you so much for that. Appreciate it.
So we have 14 minutes left, and a few things to go through. So I will try not to go too fast as we move through the next few slides, because I want to leave a bit of time at the end as well. So I think, first of all, thank you folks for being so engaged in the activities. These presentations will be open to you after this session, and so feel free to bring them back to your organizations, to go back to them, to bring them to, I know a lot of organizations now have committees that work on a lot of these topics, and so things to explore in those spaces. But for the next few slides, we're going to go over just some concepts that exist around the conversations around cultural competency. So again, we talked about the fact earlier that cultures are living beings, you know, they're always evolving, always growing. And so the idea of building skills, the idea of being in this process has to be continuous. So some of the skills that we think of as like the foundation of our toolbox when we're engaging with cultures, whether it's here or anywhere out in the world, are around what does it look like to have effective communication. So I like to use a really simple example that we'll often use here within our context is being when we come from an academic background, and often we'll use really academic language that isn't accessible to everyone, and by that process disenfranchising a lot of people. So what does it look like to use accessible language? What does it look like to have effective communication tactics or ways of communicating that really open up a space for people to engage freely and being able to be in communication, in community, and collaboration, because I think that will always be the first step of us understanding how we're building a foundation for trust. And then coming from different backgrounds, we understand that there's understanding of nonverbal communication. So a lot of what isn't said, and understanding that some of the stuff that we're communicating doesn't have to do with the things that are coming out of our mouths. So having the skill of being able to recognize, what does it mean that someone refuses to make eye contact? It's a really common example that in some cultures, making eye contact is considered disrespectful, and some some cultures, not making eye contact is seen as disrespectful. And so we see the conflict that can be brought up there. And when one community is already marginalized or diminished, that obviously adds another layer to how we're coming together and working through a conflict that has to do with respect. Active listening skills, so making sure that when we're listening to adapt, listening to be accountable, listening to understand. A lot of the time when we see the engagement through power dynamics, we do see a lot of listening for the sake of listening and not really taking in the information as valid, important, and crucial to the work that we're doing. So what does it look like to be listening and making sure that we're asking questions? Even sometimes we may think that we don't have questions, but what does it mean to be asking questions to make sure that we're understanding things correctly? Building relationships, what does it look like to prioritize building relationships? And I think it's always interesting when I use the term building relationships, because being in the field that I'm in, I think the idea of building relationships is one that is in such a flux right now. There's so much new information, new perspectives that are coming out, how the complexities of building relationship, of genuine relationships, and especially in a society that has so historically broken down our understanding of what it means to build relationships. So what does it look like to build genuine, accountable, respectful, responsible, committed relationships with the people that we are working with in ways that are relevant to the relationships and the type of trust that we are kind of basing that process over. Culturally appropriate engagement, so making sure that we understand the cultural etiquette, the cultural protocols that are expected of us when we're engaging with different communities. So I know that I like to use the example that I didn't grow up with part of my family, and when I went to my sister's wedding, I did to a certain extent know this, but in my house it had been fine. But I went to my sister's wedding and I ate from the pot with my left hand, and that was not acceptable at all. And so what does it look like to understand the protocols that exist in a way where we are being respectful, we are showing that we are engaged, and that we are valuing the traditions and the cultures that we're engaging with, and making sure that we are showing the respect that we have to even begin the conversation often. So things like addressing seniors first. Adapting practices. So again, one of the main skills, the most important skills, is being able to be accommodating, being able to adjust. It is the la ligne directrice. It goes through all that we do. Being in a process that challenges system requires us to be able to consistently adapt, adjust, and accommodate, and prioritize that practice. And so making sure that what is at the foundation of us learning skills is learning those skills so that we adapt the way that we engage, we adapt the way that we prioritize, we adapt the way that we monitor and reflect all of the things that make up our system. How do we make sure that we're adapting it to make room for the new skills and the new goals and the new ways that we're trying to bring into our work and our way of engaging? The next three models or concepts that are being brought up are concepts that I think have obviously a few conversations happening around them. And I think it's important for us. A lot of the times, a lot of these were done with studies outside of just the Western context, but I think I'm bringing them up as more a way of us being able to evaluate ourselves more so than overgeneralizing. So this first model I really like for the idea of how we see ourselves moving through the process of becoming more culturally aware and sensitive. And so I think it's always important for us to understand kind of where we fall and how we're moving forward. So the idea of starting at denial and sometimes moving the needle, but moving to defense, where we're still not really wanting to recognize other cultures as equal. So we may see that there are other cultures that exist, but still that they're inferior. So kind of diminishing their existence, which continues in kind of the minimization, where we have more of an idea, we have more space for the idea of other cultures, but we're still kind of I like to use the example of kind of like we're all one human race. There's no difference. So kind of minimizing the importance of the diversity of cultures. So defense is more kind of diminishing other cultures as inferior, while minimization is just kind of not really wanting to engage, maybe seeing that there is an importance in the fact that culture exists, acknowledging cultural differences, but kind of being like, what's most important is that we're all human. That kind of idea. Acceptance is, we are at the point where we accept and we understand that there are different cultures, and adaptation is we're putting a lot of importance into making sure that we are adjusting our behaviors, our perspectives, our way of doing, to engage respectfully with other cultures. And then integration. So you kind of move through the process, you have the skills, you have the tools, you've built the trust, and you're able to kind of navigate different cultural contexts and scenarios. Ooh, 5 minutes. So this model kind of again shows us different kinds of cultural models. So again, earlier we talked about individualism or collectivism or communitarianism. Communitarianism. So kind of the idea of prioritizing the individual versus the community. There is, for example, the way that we see time, so sequential versus synchronic. So the idea that time needs to be strict and we have to have a schedule versus kind of the time being flowing, which we've seen through different interactions can bring up conflict, and kind of the same idea as the looking in the eyes or not looking in the eyes can kind of challenge people's understanding of what's respectful or not. And so these are just kind of models that it's important for us to know kind of where we stand compared to other models. What do we prioritize? And I think that's always when we're building cultural competency, it is really important to be very clear on what do we prioritize, what's important to us, what are we going to really hold on to? And especially because these processes really engage accountability. When you're in an accountability process, a lot of the time, what you prioritize is going to become very important very fast. And so being clear on what that is, if you are committed to these processes, and knowing how to navigate and build accountability processes and be really transparent in moments of conflict or rebuilding trust or kind of acknowledging harm is really important. This is another kind of model that talks about different dimensions. It really talks about how we understand how a culture's values and beliefs will affect the behaviors of those within the culture. So the model talks about masculinity versus femininity. I've kind of always interpreted it as patriarchal versus matriarchal. So we live in societies where societies are kind of built off of how we attribute different qualities, expectations, limitations on different genders, and then build our societies around them by giving essentially giving our cultures and our societies that gender. So being in a patriarchal society, we prioritize competitiveness and how much we're achieving, while matriarchal societies can have different priorities. There are long-term versus short-term orientation societies, so cultures, and so kind of what does it look like to be focused more on building long-term or understanding ourselves in the long term versus the short term. And that can have really big effects on what a culture is prioritizing, what's important to them, how they're engaging with us. And that is really important for us to know where we stand in relation to the communities that we're working with, because when we have different priorities in terms of like how our goals are set up and how everything fits into our worldview and how we view ourselves in the future, that can have some pretty big implications, especially in the way that we build projects that support kind of projecting into the future and building a different way. So what does it look like to have those different priorities? This is a slide where folks can come back to. They're just some really simple questions to kind of ask yourself in terms of that kind of like skill building process, navigating aspect of the cultural competency continuum process. So Are we aware of diverse nonverbal communication norms in other cultures? Do we adapt our projects and ways of work to local cultures? Are we open to being accountable? Do we offer reliability? Are we reliable? And in that question, what do we prioritize? Can we be reliable based off of what we're prioritizing and what comes up in the relationships that we have community to community? Confined by what our priorities are, what our project priorities are, etc. So the idea of this work is always that this is an ongoing journey. This is one small block in a huge puzzle, in a huge process that really defines the rest of our lives. And how we choose to engage with others, how we choose to build what's important to us, what we prioritize, our goals, who we are. And so these are some of the things that we throw into our toolbox of building our journey. So making sure that we're having moments of self-assessment and reflection. So what does it look like to do an organizational SWOT assessment, but what does it also look like to do a personal SWOT assessment? Implementing what does it look like to be in the implementation and monitoring of progress? So how are we getting feedback? How we built the trust to make feedback something that's worthwhile? Do we have reliable data because we have built enough trust for people to give open feedback, even if it's anonymous? Do people feel comfortable sharing their opinions and being able to give us our feedback on our journeys? Reflect and update and adapt. So continuing to be accountable, continue to be accommodating, engaging in continuous education. This is one that always is going to be really important. What do we do when it's just us? What are we engaged in? What are we committing to in terms of building our toolbox and continuing to be educated and engaged in a way where we're being tested and grown and pushed outside of our comfort zones and kind of stretching our knowledge. I always say this when I introduce myself. My title is an expert, but I have never been an expert. I will never be an expert. I'm in a continuous journey of learning by being in relationship to different communities, intergenerationally, of being able to be challenged and called out by different folks when I am on the wrong path, and being able to be redirected with care and an understanding that learning is something that is again a vulnerable space, but it's something that we all have to be committed to, as we are committed to being in relationship to each other in a good way. So it's always just a reminder at the end that this is ongoing and that this is something that we can be committed to on the long term. We are over by 1 minute, so I want to say a big thank you. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to kind of go back into conversation. But just wanted to throw out for folks, we have a training happening August 8th on building organizational anti-racism policies. They're open to everybody, whether you have an organization policy or not. The idea is that folks throughout the organizations are able to come and also just understand what these processes look like, what they require, what does it look like to be in these processes, so that we all have the information. A lot of the time, different spaces feel like they're meant for different people, but we all need the information to be able to be engaged in a way where we all get to engage our autonomy and participate in processes with all of the information. So it's open to everyone, August 8th. Then we have the Cooperation Canada's Futures Forum that's happening October 8th to 10th. So that website is up for organizations to register and to send folks to. The archive will have a few sessions at the forum. We'll have one on ethical means of storytelling, kind of challenging the way that we report, how we talk about communities, just all of the ways that storytelling comes up in our work. We'll have one where we'll be launching our report and talking about progressive movements, and we'll have one on reconciliation. And then we have every last Tuesday of the month office hours. No one has come so far, but if you have time, we have one every last Tuesday of the month at noon. And lastly, we'll be starting up our BIPOC community check-in. So they'll look out for that. If you are interested in signing up for our newsletter, you can do so in our post-event survey. Just let us know that you're interested. And yeah, I'm so sorry for how fast that we've had to move this, and I'm grateful for everyone for having been engaged and staying through. Looking forward to getting to engage with you further in different spaces, and I hope that you know that we're always here to talk and explore and learn and grow together, and just always really happy to be in relation. So thank you, and we're hoping that you have an amazing rest of your day, an amazing rest of your week, and yeah, we'll see you soon.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you. C'est super. Au revoir.
Bonjour, bonjour.